June 24, 1812. 5 in the morning. Napoleon Bonaparte stands on the banks of the Neman River, at the border between Lithuania and Tsarist Russia. At his side, 685,000 soldiers. The largest military invasion in history up to that moment. But as Napoleon looks back at his army, he sees something that disturbs him. His diaries record it. Torrential rain has turned the roads into mud. His horses are starving. His men are already murmuring. Napoleon mounts his horse. He crosses the river. The invasion of Russia, which he promised would be finished in 3 months, is beginning. Napoleon had conquered almost all of Europe. Austria, Prussia, Spain, they all fell before him. But there was one enemy he had never defeated: Russia. Tsar Alexander I had broken the Treaty of Tilsit in 1811. The Franco-Russian alliance had collapsed. Napoleon knew he had only one summer to win before winter. Russia's invisible ally destroyed him. But there was a problem that Napoleon perhaps underestimated. His generals knew what no one dared say aloud. Russia possessed an advantage that gold and tactics could not overcome: infinite space. The depth of Russian territory was unknown to him. His maps were imprecise. And the Tsar had a strategy that Napoleon would only begin to understand when it was already too late. Don't fight. Just retreat. The first days seemed to work. On June 28th, the Grande Armée captured Vilna, the Lithuanian capital. Napoleon was euphoric. But within a week, the truth emerged. His soldiers were deserting. Not from cowardice, from necessity. Military records show that in July 1812, Napoleon lost more soldiers to desertion, disease, and starvation than in any battle. His supply lines stretched for hundreds of miles. The Russian landscape was desolate. Entire cities were burned by the Russians themselves before Napoleon arrived, a documented scorched earth tactic. Napoleon now faced a dilemma that no tactic could solve: continue advancing toward Moscow, pushing deeper into enemy territory, far from supplies, or retreat and preserve his army. Retreating meant losing prestige, losing the illusion of invincibility, losing political support across Europe. Continuing meant possible annihilation of his entire force. On September 7, 1812, Napoleon finally confronted the Russian army at the Battle of Borodino. This was the largest single day of battle in the Napoleonic era up to that point. 250,000 soldiers clashed. 70,000 were killed or wounded, all in one day. Napoleon watched from a nearby hill. His diaries and accounts from witnesses, such as his aide-de-camp, the Count of Segur, describe his reaction. According to the Count of Segur's testimony in his memoir, History of Napoleon, Napoleon watched the carnage. When asked to send the Imperial Guard, his last fresh troops, to decide the battle, he refused. He said he had already lost 30,000 men and could not recover from a defeat at this moment. What Napoleon had never done in his previous campaigns, hesitate at the critical moment, he did now. Technically, Borodino was a French victory. The Russians retreated. But it was a victory that cost everything. And Napoleon knew it. After Borodino, Napoleon did what his generals feared. He continued advancing toward Moscow. A week later, on September 14th, he entered the city. But Moscow was empty. The Russians had burned it behind them. Enormous fires raged on every side. There was no food. There was no adequate shelter for the 100,000 soldiers who remained of his original Grande Armée. Napoleon remained in Moscow for 5 weeks. He waited for a sign of surrender from the Tsar. No sign came. On October 19th, he faced the truth his generals already knew. It was impossible to stay. The retreat began. The retreat from Moscow is known as one of the greatest military disasters in history. But the numbers don't tell the full story. A French soldier who lived through it, an officer named Philippe Paul de Segur, left written records that allow us to understand not just what happened, but how it felt. Beginning on October 19th, With roughly 100,000 combat-ready soldiers remaining, Napoleon started the march back west. Winter arrived earlier than in previous years. Temperatures dropped to -30 degrees Celsius. Medical records and soldiers' letters describe men falling asleep in the snow and never waking, horses collapsing dead along the roadside, officers amputating their own frozen fingers with knives. The Berezina River presented the next crisis. From November 26th to 29th, Napoleon had to cross while being pursued by the Russians. His bridges were built under fire. Tens of thousands of soldiers trampled over each other to cross. Hundreds fell into the frozen river. They died there. When Napoleon finally left Russia on December 5th, he had only 20,000 to 24,000 soldiers remaining out of 685,000. Approximately 400,000 dead. 100,000 prisoners. The rest, missing, deserters, or irreparably wounded. On December 5th, in a village in Latvia, Napoleon handed over command of what remained of the Grande Armée to his Marshal Ney. He departed in a carriage for Paris. He needed to regain control of an empire that probably suspected he had vanished. The man who had conquered Europe had merely escaped with his life. Why does what Napoleon did in 1812 matter today, in 2024? Because this is the story of how absolute power encounters its limits.
Napoleon was brilliant.
His generals were experienced. His logistics were, at that moment, superior to any army in Europe. But none of that could overcome space, climate, and the will of a people to burn their own city rather than surrender. Historians have debated for 200 years. Should Napoleon have retreated before Borodino? Should he have listened to his generals when they said winter was impossible? Should he have understood that some enemies cannot be conquered by brute force? The answer is probably yes. Yes to all of it. But there was something in Napoleon, in his own psychology, in his own history of invincibility, that prevented him from retreating. Every general told him, retreat. Every fact around him screamed, retreat. And yet, he advanced. This is the illusion of power. That because you've won many times, you can win every time. That because the army obeyed until now, it will obey forever. That because you conquered Europe, you can conquer Russia. But Russia taught him a lesson no battle ever could. Limits exist, and some of them cannot be strategically overcome. The question that remains is this: if you were Napoleon in that moment, surrounded by 100,000 starving soldiers, with imprecise maps, facing an enemy that refuses to surrender, would you have had the wisdom to retreat? Or would you have done exactly what he did? Because there's a difference between the story we tell afterward and the choices we make in the moment, when nothing is certain.